Let's get started. I'm going to need a while to explain this all. It's a lot to explain, but it's something I'm passionate about. Been a longtime .NET developer since 1998, or that was before .NET, but all through the history of .NET. And one of the things that I've learned in the past 8 years, 9 years, is how to architect ASP.NET Core solutions in a cleaner way than previously that was popular. And so let's get started and talk about this. So this is about clean architecture and ASP.NET Core. I want to first talk about some traditional architectures that are used in ASP.NET Core solutions. One of the most common ones is the N layer. It's usually 3 projects of the following composition. Your user interface project, that can be Blazor or MVC, or Razor pages. The business logic layer, which is usually your domain and your entity classes, your service classes, where your business logic lives, basically. And that can be of any kind of pattern or design, for that layer, but it is one layer as the business logic. And then data access, commonly, this is, the DAO project, or, sometimes and I'll talk about this in a little bit, sometimes it's called infrastructure, even though it's only data, and so this is where your implementations for ADO.NET or Dapper or Entity Framework live. And so sometimes in other, project or solution designs with ASP.NET Core, there are additional layers for web application projects, like if you have a separate desktop and mobile UI application, or if the solution has APIs, backend APIs that is part of it. They may be all in one API web project or separated into multiple. And sometimes, that I've seen this in my career, there's a single project with the business logic, data access, and UI related code hosted all in the same project, which is like the ultimate monolith. They're not separated at all. So the solution view of a typical end layer architecture in ASP.NET Core, and we'll focus on end layer because it seems to be, in my experience and what I read out there over history, it seems to be the most popular, that you have. And so this is a solution view of that in .NET, and so in Visual Studio. And usually this is 3 projects with names like application core, that's your business logic; infrastructure, that's your data access; and web, that's your user interface. And even though and this is what I just mentioned on the previous slide, even though there's an infrastructure project, it's usually, and the name infrastructure, it's usually focused on database infrastructure only. And so what are some issues with the end layer architecture in ASP.NET Core? Number one, infrastructure coupling. There are no abstractions against underlying infrastructure, meaning your business logic code is tightly coupled to the infrastructure related libraries being used. For example, specific database, specific SMS sender, specific storage provider, they're integrated right there and referenced right there with your business logic in that layer. And so it is not infrastructure agnostic. So this tight coupling, to infrastructure libraries makes it difficult to change underlying infrastructure. So if you want to swap out a different cache provider, a different database engine, SMS sender, a lot more code needs to be modified. And your business logic is tied to the design also, and any shortcomings of those infrastructure related libraries being used. You don't have, the abstraction around it and handling of those shortcomings and you are inheriting those when you bring those into your business logic. And so and it's easier to duplicate code that interacts with infrastructure libraries directly, as There are no safeguards in the architecture rules to inhibit doing so. So, number one, infrastructure coupling. Number two, the configuration aspect of that underlying infrastructure and those libraries and the dependencies around them. So configuration related code is often hosted in the API and UI projects themselves. So if there are multiple, for example, multiple API or UI projects in the solution, or later additional API or UI projects are added to the solution, the configuration code is duplicated and repeated across these projects. You know, startup class, right? You know, they're going to have one in each one of those projects, and that's duplicated. So this leads to a problem that makes it more difficult to add or change common infrastructure code across multiple web projects. For example, changing the authentication provider or the logging framework. Right? Those are things you're going to use commonly across all your web applications in your solution. That changing one of those, right? You'll have to do it through, you know, however many times or however many web projects you have. So it's more difficult to update web application projects to the latest .NET Core release as well. You must go through many web application projects, however many are in your solution, to update their configurations and or configuration mechanisms to conform to a new .NET Core release. As we know, .NET Core evolves, right? So does the way you configure your .NET Core web applications. And so you must maintain that, right, when you want to upgrade. And so if you have a lot more web applications that have you know, the configuration embedded within them, then that makes it more difficult. The final thing, you know, that is an issue is kind of two things. It's testing and documentation. So when you have your infrastructure, you know, libraries directly embedded into your business logic, it makes it more difficult to write automated tests. And the reason why that is because the mocking setups are much more complex. You know, you usually must, you know, mock many more classes utilized in your infrastructure related libraries that you're referencing versus a single well-defined abstraction or an interface. So the other problem is the documentation side. You do not have a good reference of what your application actually uses in the underlying infrastructure and the related libraries. You must hunt through the entire code base or document what is externally what is being used. You may only use a subset of that functionality, for example, that an infrastructure library provides, but you would not know that because you're going to reference the entire library, and you know, you now have to hunt through the code and see what you're actually using. So that's another downside to this. So what is clean architecture? You know, it's a nice fancy name, but you know, you think it's new, but it's not new. The design is not new. It's been around for many years. First introduced by Robert C. Martin, he's also known as Uncle Bob, way back in 2011. And it's gone by other names in the past, you know, and even currently, such as onion architecture. You'll see why in here in a second. Hexagonal architecture and or ports and adapters architecture. It's gained a lot more traction as more and more infrastructure, you know, like APIs, cloud services, databases, were being used in complex web applications. It just got more and more difficult, you know, to you know, have clean code and separate the infrastructure related interactions in your code base from the actual business logic. And so this architecture gained more traction because of that. And you know, clean architecture has a main fundamental rule, you know, at the core of it, and it requires the use of abstractions, interfaces in a core project layer, you know, that defines the framework for any infrastructure related dependencies, APIs, cloud services, etc., being used in the application. That is the core tenet above all. So when do you use clean architecture? When you desire a domain-centric approach to your solution that is agnostic to the actual underlying infrastructure being used. When you want to have more than one web application, API, UI, web jobs. Oh, I think someone's not muted. I'm hearing someone talk.
You can.
We'll find it.
Your PTS on top would be good for demo. Yeah, right, yeah.
Sure.
Kelly, your mic is on.
Oh. No worries. So, you know, one is, like I said, you would desire that domain-centric approach that, you know, approach that on the business logic, right? And you don't want to, you know, concern yourself with worrying about, you know, the underlying infrastructure being used, testing that, right? Those external libraries, et cetera. Number two is when you have more than one web application, an API, UI, you know, web jobs in your solution, and you want a single point of configuration and shared dependency set up for them. And I'll show that, you know, in our deep dive, what that means. And the third point, you're developing a complex solution with business logic, you know, complex business logic that requires a lot of automated testing, and you want to reduce the time that it takes to write those tests. And I'm specifically, when I say automated testing, it means unit tests, you know, E to E test, that's something separate, you know, it's more, this is more talking about unit testing. And then you want to enforce the use of abstractions against all infrastructure dependencies used. Yes, it's a little more work up front, right? But the benefits far outweigh that minor upfront cost. So, and it's just good object-oriented programming too, you know. So here's a view of the clean architecture in a complex ASP.NET application. And this is the onion view, hence why it's called onion architecture sometimes. It's well represented in a layer fashion like an onion. That the application core layer is always at the center of this onion. And, you know, this is often called the core, and sometimes people call it domain as the project name, you know, as the project name of Visual Studio. And the core project, or this application core layer, or domain, if you want to call it domain, leverages the use of abstractions, which is interfaces in that core domain project to hide the infrastructure being used. So another view of it is the horizontal layer view. And this kind of gives you a view of, you know, how the other layers point to it. And so all layers depend inward to the application core layer. The web applications can optionally depend, and this is defined as optionally, but I always recommend you do this. You know, it is optional, but you should depend on the infrastructure layer for any configuration or dependency setup for your web applications. And I'll show this in our deep dive here in a second. The test projects only depend, and unit test projects only depend on the application core layer. They don't have to care about the underlying infrastructure. They're only going to work against those abstractions that you define, those interfaces you define for your infrastructure in running those unit tests, right? Because that's all your application is going to care about too, and that's all that's going to be injected is those abstractions. And so all you need to be concerned about with is mocking up those abstractions to facilitate your unit tests, and you know that's all you need. You don't need to worry about referencing the actual infrastructure, third-party libraries or external libraries being used. So here's another view, you know, just of the projects that you might have, you know, in a clean architecture solution for ASP.NET Core, showing what's in each project. You know, you have your web app there at the top left up here, and you know, you'll have your controllers, your view models, your views, you know, any filters. And then on the bottom left, you'll have your core project, you know, application core project, and there lives your interfaces, your abstractions, your entities, you know, that you are concerned about with your domain. Any business services, domain events, application exceptions, enums, constants, all that stuff that lives in your application core project. And then your infrastructure project up there in the top right, that's where your actual implementations, where the wiring of your abstractions to the actual infrastructure you're being used or being used in your application is occurring. You'll have your individual classes that implement your interfaces that you've created for your infrastructure, and then you will wire them up together and use those third-party libraries, et cetera, infrastructure related libraries, to facilitate that, whatever it may be. And so here's a few examples in here, EF Core, Redis, Azure Service Bus, Twilio SMS service, email service, et cetera. So that's where that lives in the infrastructure project. And it is the only project that will ever reference those external libraries, infrastructure libraries, right? So that's a good point to show. So the Visual Studio solution structure of a clean architecture in ASP.NET Core is, it's usually at a minimum, 4 projects. And so you'll have your web application, which will be a API or UI. That's where your API UI specific code lives. Your application, that's the application project. This is where the business logic code lives. And there's many different ways that could be designed. Popular one, that we use on our project is, command query responsibility segregation or separation. But you may have, service design, base design, or whatever, that doesn't, matter to clean architecture. It's just more so the use of abstractions and injecting those as dependencies in the application project. So then you have your core or domain project, and this is where your abstractions and your entities and enums and constants and all your things used by your entire application live. And so that lives in the core project. And then your infrastructure project, which again is where your infrastructure specific code resides, where it's, wiring up your abstraction to the actual specific infrastructure services, providers, et cetera, used. And that's in the infrastructure project. And the infrastructure project is the only project to have external infrastructure related dependencies and specific code to interact with them. That's the only one, and I'm making that clear here, right? So no other project will reference, as you see here on the right, the entity framework, core, for example. Only the infrastructure project will do that. No other project will, reference or bring in any packages to infrastructure related libraries. So let me switch to a demo here, and I just want to walk through this, and kind of talk about, in depth the different pieces of a clean architecture solution in ASP.NET Core. And as we just saw in that screenshot on the right, this is very similar. You have your web application. Oh, it didn't switch. Let me switch the.
Yeah, let me make sure they're recording to the partner stream.
Yeah. Shared full screen. Interesting. Just switch to that. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sharing my entire screen, but oh, that's right. Yes. Let me drag it over for the people here. Here. There it is. Okay. Let me switch the screen here. Because I need to see it. Oops. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to. Yeah. this. I can use this. Oh. Yeah, the problem is my laptop is looking at the other screen. Here you are. This is being, I'm just gonna use a trackpad. Okay. All right, so in the, this ASP.NET Core solution,
Hey,
we
Daniel?
have, yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
so we can only see the slides online.
Okay, yeah, yeah. That's what I was afraid of. So let me. Yeah, fortunately.
Share again. Screen two.
Okay. Oh. The mouse is being, not behaving. Do you see it now, Jeff?
Yes, that's good.
Okay. So this is just a view of the ASP.NET Core solution, with clean architecture. Let me find my mouse here. Unfortunately, it's not working. Okay, there we go. Now let's see, hope it stays consistent. So let me drag this out here. The view on the screen in the thing kind of gives it a a more larger view. But I want to scroll through this and just show you each one of these pieces in depth, these projects. So you have your web application, the API. This is an API. And then you have your actual application project. This is where your business logic lives. And this one's, like I was saying before, it's utilizing command query responsibility separation. And so it's organized like that, but actual business logic lives in these handlers, which I'll explore here in a bit. And then you have your core project. This is where entities, and we're showing a database abstraction of infrastructure here. And so we have just our repository interfaces, that live in the core project. And you'll see in a second here in the infrastructure project where they're used. And so in the infrastructure project, we have EF core being implemented, or being used specifically. And then here you'll see this is where, you're taking and wiring up these, abstractions, your interfaces, your iRepository. Let me open this. And this is implementing just a generic, repository with, generic defined for your entity that it'll work against. So, it just has basic operations, get all, get by ID, add, update, delete. And then you have a specific abstraction, to the employee entity directly. And it just offers up specific operations that you'll need to use against your employee, for example, like getting an employee by last name. And so these are your interfaces. Again, they're in that core project. And then in your infrastructure project, this is where your classes live that implement those interfaces and use EF core underlying to hook into EF core and wire in your abstraction to EF core, the underlying infrastructure provider for the database. And so you'll see that's the generic repository implementation, with your add, delete, get all, get by ID, and then here's your actual employee repository. Again, it's going to inherit, the base repository implementation, pass in the employee entity as the generic, and then implement the iEmployee repository as well to provide that employee specific database operation, get employee by last name. So, but yeah, that's the kind of the number one rule with clean architecture you have to do is having that abstraction that you have for your underlying infrastructure, in this case a database, and using that in your business logic, which I'll just show here in a second. So if we go back up to our business logic, our application project, that's where it lives. So for example, it will have these handlers, again, it's using CQRS. And so if we're creating an employee, for example, you're going to see where it injects our abstraction, our iEmployee repository right here in the constructor. So whenever this object or this handler is constructed, it's going to get our iEmployee repository abstraction, our interface. And then in its handle method, it's going to use that injected employee repository to perform the add operation. So your business logic does not reference or know about that entity framework core is being used, behind the scenes, right? To add the employee to the database. It is totally agnostic to that. And so all it knows is, hey, I have an employee repository and it has an add async method, and I'm just going to give it the entity and it's going to go and insert it into the database. So I don't need to know what database or, what third-party library is being used to do that. You don't see any of referencing of that at all in your business logic. And so that's what makes it clean, right? Is you not knowing or not needing to know the underlying infrastructure that's being used. In this case, for a database, but it can, it can be for SMS provider, file storage, right? Service bus, messaging, caching, whatever it is, right? It's always just going to get, injected into its constructor, those abstractions, those interfaces that you've defined for your infrastructure, and that's what it works against. That's it. So the other thing I wanted to show in this deep dive is the configuration side. And I feel I wanted to do this because I feel like it's a part of clean architecture in the examples you see out there, even the ones that I've referenced here at the end of the presentation, that they don't go far enough, right? They kind of leave that out of clean architecture, and I just feel like it's also a very important part of clean architecture, is the configuration side of your web applications. So you'll notice in this web application, this API, I've created a startup clean and a startup dirty class, and so I want to show the dirty one first, which is the typical startup class that you get, with your .NET Core application. First, I want to talk of, the structure of it, right? They define, that a startup class should have a public configure method, which accepts an iApplication Builder instance and a iWeb host environment instance, and then also configure services method. And so these two methods are what, will configure your application, build it out. Configure more focuses on the HTTP request pipeline, and setting that up, for your web application. That's mostly what it deals with. There are sometimes some things outside of that it does, but most of the time, it's going to do things like, configuring HTTPS, redirection, routing, authorization, endpoints, that kind of setup. And then your configure services method is going to be a more, focused on the infrastructure of your application. So if you have controllers in your web app, of course, you're going to add those to the host, right? And so it knows, how to respond to certain requested URLs, etc. And then your DB context here, that's a database, right, that you're going to set up. But I want to make it clear that this is the dirty way to do it, right? You shouldn't be doing this here in your web application, because this add DB context is an entity framework core specific thing, right? And so now you've bled entity framework core into your web application, which that is a bad thing with clean architecture. So, and here it's setting up for your entity framework core DB context that you're using SQL Server, right? And it's setting up the connection string for it. But you also have other things, like this is using Swagger, this API, and so this is the setting up the Swagger gen for that. And then you'll have, this isn't necessarily infrastructure, right? You can have, third-party kind of utility services like AutoMapper or Mediator, right? That also live in this configure services method. And then finally, you have your dependency setup, that also comes from this configure services method. And so basically, this is always living. This code is and when you start a ASP.NET Core web application, it gives you this class, right? And it has this configuration code in there for you to start, right? And so what many developers do is they just add to it, right? If they want EF Core, well, I'm just going to add EF Core right here, right? Because it's right here, and I'll just do that, right? But that's a bad thing. You violated the clean architecture rule of separation of infrastructure from the other project. So this is a dirty example, right? And then I have a clean example. Let me show it here. And so you'll notice here, here's the configure method. It's only one line, right? And that's in it. And then configure services, it's only a couple lines. So in all, it's much less code, right? It's cleaner, right? But that code, that was in the dirty one, right? It has to go somewhere, where does that go? And so it goes where it should go, and that is in the infrastructure project. And so you'll notice, we have two folder or namespaces here, one API, one application for our API project and for our application project. Yeah, and let me point this out too. I neglected to point this out in the previous one, the dirty one. You'll notice that some of these dependencies, for example, and then also even this infrastructure, in the dirty example, it's setting it up right here, in the startup class, and it gives the impression that the API project uses these, right? But in reality, the project or library that's using these dependencies and EF Core is the application project. And so you'll notice in the clean one, we separate that out, right? We have configure API app, for configuring the HPS pipeline or HP pipeline stuff, but also we have it in the configure services method. We have a configure API services specific to the API, right? To its project, and then configure application services and configure application dependencies specific to the application project, right? And so like I said, that this code that was in the dirty startup, right? It's now going to be in the infrastructure library. And so if we look in the API and the application namespaces in the infrastructure project, let me start with the API. There's a configuration class in there. You'll have, that configure API app method that I was showing in the clean, under the configure method here. And this is where, that HTTP pipeline setup lives. And the big benefit to this, right, is by having it in this centralized location in the infrastructure library, is if you had more than one API project, they're going to use all this the common way, right? They're going to have, Swagger, right? They're going to have the same authorization almost always, the same, rules for routing and HTTPS. They're going to need all that set up, right? And so why have that duplicated, X number of times for however many APIs you have? Now you've created the single point of configuration where they all can use this same configuration for the HTTP pipeline. And so that's that's one big benefit. And then show here, my mouse back, there it is. And then you have the services side, right? That configure services method side. And then this now only focuses on the API. So it's only doing add controllers, right? That's in my API project. I have controllers. I need to add those to the host. And so I also have Swagger, right? But it's only those two things, right? Versus, all this other stuff, right? It doesn't need that for the API. And so it shows, there gives that good documentation about what specific infrastructure things are used in the API project itself. And so if we look at the application library or project side of its configuration, you'll see, it has, you configure application services. And now this is where the setup of entity framework core, right? And any other, third-party libraries or utility frameworks you're using, that's where it lives in the application configuration side, right? It shows specifically that, hey, my application library uses EF core, uses AutoMapper, uses Mediator. I don't need to, I don't give the impression or false impression that the API project is using these, right? Because it's not using any of these. And then also you get your specific dependency setup, right? That you use for your application project. And so here, I'm using, like I showed earlier, the iGeneric repository, iRepository, and then the iEmployee repository and those handlers, right, that I showed earlier. That's going to be wired up here in the application specific configuration, right? Which application meaning application library. And so you separate, however, many libraries you have, et cetera. Usually you only have just one application. But if you had additional ones that focused on others, you might have another namespace for those to configure their specific dependencies, right? And their specific infrastructure. But, most of the time in the large scale projects I've been involved in, most of them are, you just have your application library. You don't separate it out any more than that. But there could be a good reason to do that. And if you did, well, then you have just another namespace, with the configuration CS in it. And it's focused specifically on that library and what it needs. So yeah, that's just, I wanted to show that because I feel like, in the examples out there that are available, today, they kind of go short on this configuration side and don't talk about it much. And it leads to, like I said, in that dirty example, the violation of clean architecture where you're directly, referencing or using third party or external infrastructure libraries directly in your web application when you should not be. It should be agnostic, just like your application project or layer. So yeah, that's what I wanted to show with that. And then let me switch back to the slide here. Just my screen. And also I'll drag. There we go. Make sure Jeff can see it before I continue.
Looks good. Good. See the slides.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, sir. Oh, let me bring it up here. Else kind of gets delayed there. Okay, so I wanted to talk about next, or in review, the there we go. The rules around clean architecture and ASP.NET Core. And when I say rules, they're guidelines, more than anything. And so all the abstractions and entities used, in your solution should again reside in your core project. All projects can reference the core project, but the core project does not reference any other project or external library. It stands on its own, right? It doesn't, reference another project in your solution, doesn't reference any other external libraries. It is the .NET Core, framework and nothing else, and that's it. And then your infrastructure is where your infrastructure project is where all specific code to any APIs, databases, cloud services, etc. lives. the specific infrastructure related classes written will implement your interfaces, your abstractions defined in your core project, like we saw, with the repository example, while consuming that specific infrastructure libraries used. And then all shared infrastructure related configuration and dependency setup for all your web applications in the solution lives in that infrastructure project, just like I showed in that dirty versus clean configuration example. And the reason for this is it makes it much easier to maintain going forward, one place versus many, right? And then also, the single project that is the only one referencing those externally used infrastructure libraries, which is your infrastructure project. So there are some great resources, for learning more about clean architecture and ASP.NET Core. One is Common Web Application Infrastructure, review by Microsoft. It gives a great overview from, the older N layer, N tier design to now the clean architecture design. And I think soon it'll probably be updated for vertical slicing too, vertical slice architecture. That's gaining popularity pretty recently, but and two big guys that really tuned me into this many years ago, Steve Smith and Jason Taylor. They have great YouTube videos about clean architecture. Jason has even put out there a solution template for clean architecture, and he goes, a little more in depth about, the other kind of frameworks or patterns you can implement in your application layer and leverage the clean architecture design to have a great design and separation of infrastructure for those, like domain events, for example. And Jason, also has a great YouTube video about clean architecture using his template. It's there on YouTube. It's a great resource. I highly recommend, if you have some extra time, you look at both of those YouTube videos from Steven and Jason. They're really good. So with that, I'll take any questions and answers.
Or is there some sort of utility precompiled stuff where you point out that you're using some any framework in the UI layer?
That's a great question. So unfortunately, there's nothing like at compile time that can enforce it, right? You have to really explain this to your team, right? And watch for those violations in your peer reviews, your pull requests. There's nothing that enforces, the injection of an infrastructure related specific library from being added to the application project, for example, right? There's nothing to prevent that. You can go ahead and do that, right? There's nothing in .NET to facilitate against that. It's more the educating your team members about, hey, we're, philosophy here on our team is clean architecture. Please do not put, an infrastructure related library specifically in or tied or tightly coupled to our business logic, right? Don't do that, adding the direct reference to, EF core in the application project. So yeah, it's more of, you have to watch out for those violations in your PRs. And so, yeah.
Pretty first pass at that, because you're just looking to see if anything in that package needs.
Yes. Oh yeah. You're exactly right. It's not hard, right? But I'm just making it clear that there's nothing to, there's nothing to prevent. Now, you could maybe, Arthur, set up some PR kind of checks, right, against that, in your CI/CD, to say, hey, you've added a reference, right? You shouldn't add any reference to core, right? And so so you could add those kind of rules, right, in your CI/CD or in your PR rule set, right? But I'm just saying from Visual Studio, right? There's nothing to prevent that, right? And so, yeah.
So for projects that are currently using the traditional NT architecture, some of us,
Yes.
what what are your thoughts in terms of migrating towards this?
Yes.
Is that even possible, or do you need?
It is. No, of course, it's great if you're starting fresh, right? And you can do this, right? But you can also begin to, instill the clean architecture philosophy against a existing end layer, design or end tier design project. Start small, like with whatever new infrastructure you're going to bring in, right? Or any that's existing that's small, start there, make an abstraction for it, right? And set up the dependency for it in the infrastructure project. If you don't have an infrastructure project, start one, right? And then start small, start with your smaller infrastructure pieces or your new ones that are small. And if you have time to do that, and then as you get more time, create that tech debt, work items to convert the larger ones into clean architecture. So yeah, it's.
My second, I have a thought.
Yeah.
My second question. I like the configuration of the startup class system infrastructure. It's always a mess.
That's right.
You got
Yes.
A lot of duplication. Question though is, doesn't that also just bring a lot of more dependencies down in the infrastructure? Because if you're configuring your API layer in your infrastructure.
Yep.
Now you gotta bring all of those.
It sure does. Yeah.
Is that good? Is that?
That's
bad?
good.
It feels like that's
No,
good.
that's good because, you're gonna have, for example, in the EF core example we just showed, in the dirty example of the startup, you're gonna have EF core already in your infrastructure, right? To set up your context and stuff. So you're not really adding anything. You are adding a little bit.
Thinking about the web.
Yeah. You are adding a little bit in terms of the ASP.NET Core host, right? But that's okay. It's ASP.NET Core, it's .NET Core. It's not much, weight to that, right? Or added file size to your library, et cetera. It's good, right? And so, and it's good because now you uncoupled that tight dependency to EF core in your API project. So, and other things, right? We're just talking EF core, but yeah.
Is your code example, is it somewhere we can look at it, like the one you demoed?
Yeah, I can make this available. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Joel.
How popular is this .NET? You got a sense for like the people starting?
I would say it's probably 25-30%, and I say that just because it takes you a while to wrap your mind around it all, right? And how to do it well. And like Greg pointed out, many times you are in that end tier architecture already, and it's hard to break out of that, and so I would say the people that have adopted it are the ones who started newer, .NET Core applications from the start, right? But it's gaining momentum, as time goes on, it's more and more, it's going to go up and up, so.
Has Microsoft embraced it?
Yes, yeah, that article, that first one I gave on the reference, yeah, they specifically talk about that's the final part of that article, like, we give you the bad ones at first, right? And then this is what you should do, and so, yeah, that's how it's constructed.
Last question from
Oh, I would say, yes, like Spring Java, I've seen clean architecture for that, I haven't delved into it much to see, is it the same, solution, architecture or design, but I see clean architecture with, Spring Java and other languages too, yeah. Okay.
So let's say I'm talking to a customer or stakeholder, and the customer says, got it into your application that we want to convert over.
Yes.
What's the argument for it? Why should how can I
Yeah.
convince my customer that we should take the tech debt on to do
Great
this?
question. So I would convince them to say, over the long term, the maintainability of a clean architected solution saves you money. It saves you development cost, right? In terms of time spent writing those unit tests, et cetera. And time spent maintaining the code base itself, because again, it's much cleaner because you're just working against those abstractions, in your business logic. You don't have to you're not gonna have duplicated code or excess code around that infrastructure. That's gonna be reduced. And so it really boils down to you're gonna save the customer money, but also save them time. I'd make that clear too, that it's gonna be quicker to build new features that have testing behind it, because the tests and such won't need to be as complex with the actual specific infrastructure libraries being used and having to mock those right against those and such. But then also the as you build this out, I want to make this clear, as you build this out, you'll see other productivity or time benefits to this. And like one we just saw on our project recently is our client had Azure functions doing background jobs, right? Independently of the web application code, right? And the solution, right? And there was a lot of duplicated business logic, being in those Azure functions. We've now created a framework within the same web project solution. It's leveraging web jobs, right? But it's another web project within that solution that uses that application project for all of its business logic. And again, it's just using, dependency injection for all those infrastructure pieces used. And it's so much quicker to stand up a job, that they want data for or whatnot, or to process data, than it would be to stand up a separate Azure function, bring over that business logic, right, from the main web application, or if it's if you're lucky and it's in the function project already, then you're going to try to duplicate it or reuse it, right? And so you end up saving a lot of time in standing up new features with the clean architecture solution as well. So I try to say it all boils down to money, right? They'll save money, but you'll get things quicker too with a clean architected solution in terms of features or bug fixes, et cetera, just because it's cleaner, and so, yeah. Yeah.
So what do you think? There's always trade-offs, right?
Yes.
So I actually investigated this and I thought personally that there's a lot more abstraction, which is kind of the point, right?
That's right,
Like to create
yes.
all these separations.
Yes.
But the problem is that always comes with a cost.
That's
You can't-
right,
Like
yes.
you can't just add abstractions without something giving, right? So
Yeah.
like, what do you think the potential downsides are of this versus N tier versus maybe what historically had been there?
Yeah, so one of the downsides to this is, you always have to think about those abstractions, right? You're locking yourself into that, right? And you always have to maintain those going forward as well, right? Where if you didn't have those, you have that full, specific infrastructure library you're using, right? Available right then and there, right? You could just go directly use it, right? You don't have to worry about, oh, well, how does this, do I have to add, certain methods to my abstraction to make that, possible, right? Or, model my abstractions differently, right? Or, for example, for more complex infrastructure scenarios, I make it simple, like just by showing interfaces, but you may have, certain parameters that are used by that specific infrastructure library that you have to abstract out, right? And so that adds that cost of you having to think about all of that right up front, and whether or not you're going to use those things, and thinking about that a little bit into the future too, so you don't hinder your abstraction any, like if later you want to take advantage of those things, right? And so that is difficult, right? You need developers that can think like that too, on your team. And so that is a downside to clean architecture, is like you said, that abstractions, and you always having to think about the current and the future when you're developing. So yeah, that is the downside. And it's that upfront cost too. But I said, like I said, it's an upfront cost, but in the end, you get it back, right? With the reduced time in writing tests, and the reduced time in figuring out, what your application's actually using in infrastructure, and accounting for that, right? And managing that. And so it is a trade-off, so. But I've used it now on 4 projects, 4 pretty large projects, and man, I can't go back. Like I tell everyone that's like, I'm like, it's worth that abstractions cost, you know, with the benefit you gain from it. It's just, there's no way I can go back to the old way. So, yeah. Yeah. All right. You bet.